Nah, stop scrolling. Because this isn't about sneakers. This is about power, legacy. In the moment women's basketball quietly crossed a line it can never uncross, two shoeboxes. That's where this story really starts. One of them is pristine, vault clean, sitting under controlled lighting in Nike's headquarters like a crown jewel, stamped across the front in bold letters. CC1, Caitlin Clark 1. The future, the investment, the shoe Nike spent 18 months preparing before she ever played a WNBA minute. The other box, worn, corners bent, label fading, I won barely visible. And that contrast, it shook the league, because one shoe is being positioned to define an era. The other is being quietly moved aside, and that's where this WNBA engaging story turns uncomfortable. For years, A'ja Wilson was the standard. Not hype, not potential. Proof MVPs, championships, Olympic gold. A resume so heavy it bends the table it sits on. When people said best player in the world, nobody argued. They just nodded. And Nike knew it. That's why her signature existed in the first place. But then Caitlin Clark happened, not slowly, not subtly, like a meteor. College records shattered. Arenas sold out. Ratings spiked. Jerseys flying off shelves. Casual fans suddenly knowing WNBA schedules. People who never watched women's basketball arguing about logo threes on Twitter. And Nike noticed something the league wasn't ready to admit yet. Attention had shifted, not from greatness, but toward gravity. Because here's the truth brands live by. Greatness earns respect. Gravity moves markets. And Caitlin Clark has gravity. The CC1 wasn't rushed. It wasn't reactionary. It was planned, built, positioned. While everyone was still debating whether she'd translate, Nike was already manufacturing belief. That's why NBA stars started wearing her colorways before her shoe officially existed. That's why the hype felt coordinated, because it was, in somewhere else. Another phone was being picked up, scrolled, watched, seeing Clark everywhere, not jealousy, not anger. Something heavier. Because when you've done everything right, and the spotlight still moves, it forces a question nobody wants to ask out loud. Is the game changing? Or is the business finally catching up? That tension, that's what Nike just unleashed. Because once one shoe becomes the face of the future, every other legacy gets reevaluated, not erased, but recontextualized. And that's why this isn't about disrespect. It's about what happens when a league meets its first true crossover moment and isn't prepared for the fallout. Because once the CC1 dropped into the conversation, nothing stayed neutral. And what happens next? That's where this story gets explosive. Asterisk, here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Nike didn't choose between players. Nike chose timelines because while A'ja Wilson was stacking MVPs and championships, the league was still fighting for oxygen, TV windows, sponsorships, relevance. She carried the game when carrying it didn't come with mass attention, and that matters deeply. But business doesn't reward sacrifice the way fans do. It rewards momentum. When Caitlin Clark's name started pulling non-basketball fans into the conversation, Nike's data lit up. Search volume exploded. Social engagement spiked. Ticket demand followed her city to city. And suddenly, the question inside those boardrooms wasn't who's the best player. It was who moves the needle, right now. That's when the CC1 stopped being a concept and became a priority. And here's where this WNBA engaging story tightens. Because Nike didn't announce a decision. They signaled one. NBA stars wearing Caitlin's colorways before release. Teaser leaks that never happened for anyone else. A rollout that felt inevitable instead of earned. That's not an accident. That's strategy. And strategy has consequences, because when the future gets fast-tracked, the present feels skipped. When one player becomes the symbol of growth, everyone else gets measured against a new ruler they didn't design. A'ja Wilson didn't lose status, but the conversation moved past her. And that's brutal when you're still at the top of your game. Insiders say the shift was subtle at first. Less promo, fewer pushes, more silence than celebration. Not disrespect, just And in this business, that difference is everything. The dusty box isn't about neglect. It's about timing. Nike learned something hard. Women's basketball doesn't just need excellence. It needs entry points, faces casual fans can latch onto, narratives that translate beyond the court. Caitlin Clark became that entry point. Not because she's better than everyone, but because she arrived when the audience was finally listening. And that realization created a split reaction. Some fans called it overdue. Some called it unfair. Some called it inevitable. But nobody called it small. Because once brands decide who represents the future, the ripple hits locker rooms, endorsement rooms, and fan conversations alike. Suddenly, legacy isn't just about what you've done, it's about whether the spotlight still follows you. And that's where the tension truly lives. Because if the CC1 represents what's next, then what does that say about everything that came before it? And how does a league honor its foundation while racing toward its breakout moment? Those questions don't have clean answers. But they're about to collide. Publicly. Because when the sales numbers dropped, the debate stopped being theoretical. This is where opinions stopped mattering. Because once the numbers came in, the debate got real quiet. Early sales projections for the CC1 didn't just meet expectations, they blew past them. Not solid rookie launch numbers. Not promising women's basketball numbers. We're talking crossover territory. The kind of demand Nike usually only sees when a product escapes its original audience and becomes culture. That's when the tone changed. Because numbers don't argue. They don't tweet. They don't pick sides. They just expose reality. And the reality was this. Caitlin Clark wasn't just selling shoes. She was pulling new consumers into the ecosystem. People who hadn't bought women's basketball merch. People who didn't know rosters. People who didn't care about legacy debates. They cared about her. And that's a dangerous kind of success because once a brand sees expansion, not just substitution, it stops asking polite questions. It starts reallocating resources. Budgets move. Campaigns shift. Priorities harden. And suddenly, the dusty box makes sense. Not because A'ja Wilson failed, but because she'd already done her job. She built credibility. She established excellence. She carried the league when carrying it didn't come with viral moments. But Caitlin arrived at the exact second the door cracked open. That's timing, not morality. And timing rewrites hierarchies faster than talent ever could. Here's the part that made people uncomfortable inside. The league's CC1 sales didn't cannibalize other players. They expanded the pie, which means the question was never who deserves more. It was why didn't this happen sooner? Why did it take one lightning rod player to unlock an audience that had always been there? Why weren't MVPs marketed this aggressively before? Why did excellence need a phenomenon to become profitable? Those questions don't have easy answers. But they have consequences. Because once a league realizes it's been underselling itself for years, resentment follows. Toward brands, toward media, toward whoever becomes the symbol of that realization. Caitlin Clark didn't ask to be that symbol, but she became it. And A'ja Wilson, she didn't lose her greatness, but she got caught in a moment where greatness alone wasn't the headline anymore. That's the hardest part of this story. Not disrespect, not jealousy. Transition. Every sport has one. A moment where the game shifts from being about proving itself to scaling itself, and the players on either side of that line experience it very differently. One becomes the future. The other becomes the foundation. Both necessary, both uncomfortable, and Nike didn't create the tension. They revealed it because once the CC1 took off, the league had to confront a truth it wasn't emotionally prepared for. Growth doesn't wait for consensus. And once it starts, it doesn't slow down out of respect. Which brings us to the final question. What happens next after the hype? After the sales, after the shock will decide whether this moment fractures the league or finally lifts it. Here's the truth that decides everything. This moment doesn't end with a shoe. It ends with a choice. Because Nike didn't just launch the CC1, they forced the WNBA to look in the mirror, to decide whether it's going to treat growth like a threat or like a responsibility. Caitlin Clark's shoe didn't erase A'ja Wilson's legacy. It exposed how fragile legacy becomes when a league finally goes MAINSTREAMTHA. Tease the tension nobody wants to sit with. A'ja represents excellence built in silence. Years of dominance without the machine fully behind her. She didn't get a wave, she was the wave. Long before cameras knew where to point, Caitlin represents ignition. The spark that casual fans recognize instantly. The entry point. The translator between the hardcore and the curious. And here's the uncomfortable part. You need both. Nike understands that. The league is still learning it, because if the CC1 becomes a wedge, if fans are pushed to choose sides, everyone loses. Growth stalls. Narratives turn toxic. The moment collapses under its own weight. But if the league does this right, this becomes the turning point people talk about 10 years from now. The moment women's basketball stopped arguing about crumbs and started fighting for the whole table. Caitlin Clark didn't take anything from A'ja Wilson. She made the pie bigger. A'ja Wilson didn't lose relevance. She became proof of what sustained greatness looks like. And Nike placed a bet that the sport could finally scale. That bet only pays off if the league builds bridges instead of battle lines. Because here's what history tells us. Every sport has a flashpoint like this. A crossover star. A commercial moment. A decision that feels unfair until it feels obvious. The leagues that win are the ones that protect their foundations and accelerate their futures. The ones that lose, they cannibalize their own momentum. So when people ask, what did Nike do to A'ja Wilson? The real answer is harder than a headline. Nike did what businesses always do when culture shifts. They followed gravity. Now, it's on the WNBA to decide what to do with the pull. Will this be the era where women's basketball finally grows without tearing itself apart? Or will this be remembered as the moment opportunity turned into infighting? Because the CC1 didn't just change sneakers. It changed expectations. And once expectations change, there's no going back.